emmanuhouston.org. We hope to see you there so that you can keep up to date with everything that's going on as it develops. It is an unusual time in our world and in our community. Certainly, it feels unnecessary to say that again. It's a time that has generated a whole range of emotional responses, from depression to fear to anxiety to uncertainty. I and other members of the clergy have had folks speak to us about their feelings of fear, of sleeplessness, of worry. And we've shared lots of conversations about what this experience will mean to us as emotional people and as spiritual beings. The threat of this virus is no longer imaginary, it is very real. And we are afraid, many of us, for very good reasons, because of the effects of this experience on our health and the health of those we love, on our economy, and on the jobs that allow us to provide for our families. In some ways, if we're not feeling nervous or afraid at this time, that's a sign that we may not have our wits about us entirely. At this point, the science is clear-cut. The statistics are undeniable. We have, in America, you may have seen, just past the milestone of having 100,000 people positively diagnosed with the coronavirus. So in the context of that reality in our community and in our world, I want to share a question with you that I got from a member of our community recently. They reached out to me in the midst of these feelings of fear and anxiety, and they asked, is it bad to be afraid? They asked Jewishly, is there a commandment, is there a guidance, a tradition, or a custom that a faithful Jew shouldn't be afraid? Is our fear a sign that our faith isn't strong enough? Is, God forbid, it a sin to be afraid? And from one perspective of Jewish religious life, and religious life more broadly, fear may be the opposite of faith. There are so many religious texts and traditions that seek to dispel human fear about threats and dangers in the world. All of us, no matter our background, where we live or where we come from, have heard one or another religious authority seeking to assure us that all we have to do is believe in God and everything will be okay. And those who say that do, let's be fair, have abundant scriptural evidence to back up that claim. We see it all the time in religious literature. Looking just in the Torah, the commandment not to be afraid is repeated 39 times. 39 times the Torah says, do not be afraid. That's a lot. And it appears even in the Haftarah from this week. The Haftarah portion this week comes from the book of the prophet Isaiah, who commands thunderingly, Al tifchadu ve'al tirhu, do not be afraid, do not tremble. But if we want to understand the phenomenon of fear a little bit more deeply in Jewish tradition, it's helpful for us to look at the way that the Hebrew Bible talks about fear. And to be precise about it, there are actually at least two different Hebrew words that the Torah uses for fear. Two big ones, each of which has a distinct meaning. One type of fear is called pachad, and the other is called yirah. Pachad might be translated better than fear as something like terror or dread. This kind of fear, pachad, is the kind of overwhelming fear that floods our limbic system and can effectively paralyze us. We're so frightened. This is the kind of fear that comes out of the chemical response from the most primal parts of our brains. It is an irrational fear. It is a fear that most times is much larger than the object that triggered it in the first place. Pachad is the kind of fear that leads to panic, that leads to rage or to grief. And very often, a lot of pachad comes from threats outside of us, our perception of those threats that are imaginary, or at least they are exaggerated. Pachad is triggered by threats that, realistically speaking, aren't serious enough to generate that kind of animal instinct terror response. So that's one, that's pachad. The second kind of fear is called yirah. It's a very different kind of fear. It's a kind of fear that might be translated better into the English word awe. It's a kind of breathlessness that we feel when we recognize our own smallness. when we recognize how unworthy we are, how outmatched we are by something outside of ourselves that's much larger, much more overpowering than we are, or that we can hope to become. But what's interesting is that the emotional response to yirah isn't terror, it's not paralysis. It can often be a feeling of being energized, actually, of being filled with wonder, feeling inspired in the literal sense of that word, meaning inflated with spirit. This is attached to what is now the most familiar, most famous teaching of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who wrote about what he called radical amazement. For Heschel, he was describing a sense of wonder that we feel when we recognize the majesty and the mystery of the enormous, vast universe outside of ourselves. For Heschel, cultivating that sense of awe is the reason that underlies our decisions to do all of the Jewish things we do, because living Jewish life is a way of helping us remember the miraculous nature of the experience of being alive. Heschel taught that kind of mindfulness is this is a quote now, what he said is the prerequisite for an authentic awareness of that which is. In other words, we need that mindfulness, and without it, we can't fully appreciate what it means to be alive. Even when our temptation is to be drawn into selfishness, to be drawn into the narrow concerns of our own limited needs and our own selfish, self-centered experiences, Jewish life asks us to contemplate the grandeur of the universe, to turn outward and appreciate the majesty of everything around us, and then in turn to act in a way that is compatible with that sense of awe. So to return to our two types of fear, pachad is the feeling you get when the thing you're afraid of is allowed to grow and expand to unrealistic and outsized dimensions. Yirah is what happens when our sense of awe and wonder allows us to grow, allows us to expand into new dimensions ourselves. When we recognize that the universe is asking something of us, it's appropriate for us to feel at the same time intimidated by the weight of that moment, but also to allow that weight to make us feel more significant ourselves, more consequential and important than we were before. That's the kind of fear that makes us more than what we were before, not less. Now, I want to be sure to say that I'm not suggesting that there's no place for pachad in the world, that there is no appropriate place or role for terror and dread in the world. There absolutely is. There is real danger out there in the world, and there are things that we need to be afraid of. I offer this teaching not to tell you that you should at all times swap awe and wonder for normal, logical, rational awareness and caution. There are real things to be really afraid of in the world. Sometimes fear is good. Fear is the thing that helps us preserve our health and safety. Fear is the reason we have lifeguards at the swimming pool and burglar alarms on our homes. Every time anyone gets behind the wheel of a car, I hope they're accompanied by a healthy dose of pachad, of fear that will help them make the right decisions to keep themselves and everyone else safe. There is a late 18th century spiritual master named Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. You may know him for his words that have been made into a familiar contemporary folk tune. The whole world, he taught, is a very narrow bridge. The important thing is not to be afraid. But beyond that simple, pithy teaching, at the core of Rabbi Nachman's theology is a very radical idea, and that is this. Rabbi Nachman taught that most of human suffering would be eradicated if we could learn to stop being afraid of things we have no need to fear. I want to invite you to take just a second and look back and try to remember over the past year or 3 years or 5 years, think about the things that made you the most afraid. Think about the things that kept you up at night, that made you nervous and anxious. How many of them really came to pass? Some of them, I'm sure, really came to pass and did real damage, but I would guess that the majority of the things that frighten us deep inside our animal self don't come to pass at all. And when we get into the habit of fearing things we don't need to fear, we weaken our ability to act with conscience and vision in the real world when we encounter things that really do deserve pachad and dread. The trick is to make sure that the things we're afraid of are the right things. That's the spiritual trick in these days too, when so much feels so frightening and there's so much to terrorize us in the street, on the news, on the internet. So much in the world out there feels so frightening and so overwhelming and so paralyzing. I think my hope for all of us on this Shabbat and on these days moving forward, as we try to gauge the appropriate healthy amount of fear, is not to tell you not to be afraid. Let your fear be the thing that ensures that you wash your hands and take precautions and keep your distance and preserve people that are sick and vulnerable from getting into harm's way. But I want to urge us to be careful and cautious and reflective so that the things we're afraid of are the right things in the right proportion. And to ensure that part of our spiritual task is not to let pachad, not to let terror get in the way of our yirah, in the way of our awe, our sense of majesty and wonder. Our job as spiritual beings is to preserve our physical, medical, emotional health. But the end goal of that work is to make sure that we survive another day so that we can transmit to our children and to our community the spiritual values of our tradition, of awe and wonder, of appreciation of the majesty and magic of the universe and of the underlying presence of God in all of it that keeps us alive and keeps us aware of who we are and who we can become. I want to wish you a healthy, safe weekend and a peaceful Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.